At 7 in the morning, the concealer looks perfect. A woman in her 50s presses the last of it in at the bathroom mirror and leaves for work. By 9, a faint line has appeared where there was none. By 11, that line is a channel with product gathered inside it. By 3 in the afternoon, under office restroom light, the makeup meant to hide her age is announcing it instead, sitting in every fold like paint in a crack. She will blame her wrinkles, but the wrinkles are innocent. Something else failed under that eye, and this video explains exactly what and exactly how to stop it. Concealer does not crease because a face has lines. It creases because a film of pigment has been laid over the one patch of skin that almost never stops moving. And on a moving surface, every film eventually loses. The wrinkle only decides where the loss will show. Veteran makeup artists who prepare women over 50 for television have understood this for decades, which is why their under-eye work looks nothing like the instructions printed on the back of a concealer box. What follows are the 5 specific reasons the product ends up in the line, taken one at a time because each reason points to its own correction. Then comes the fix, a 5-step sequence that removes 4 of those reasons entirely and makes peace with the 5th. The last step is a repair that takes about 30 seconds at a restroom sink, requires nothing new from a store, and matters more with each hour a day runs long. Every claim along the way stays anchored to the clock, within the first hour, by midday, by the end of the day, because creasing arrives on a schedule, and a routine only deserves trust once it survives all 3 checkpoints. The first reason is the amount, and it fails before the formula is even given a chance. Concealer is pigment suspended in a cream. One thin layer dries into a film flexible enough to bend a little when the skin beneath it folds. Each additional layer thickens that film, and thickness is the enemy of flex. A door hinge painted with one careful coat opens cleanly for years, but paint that same hinge 3 times in one afternoon, and the coating cracks on the first swing. The under eye works the same way. When a second and third pass go on to cover what the first pass missed, very little coverage is actually added. Weight is added, and within the first hour the excess begins traveling, sheared loose by blinking, sliding across the surface, and settling in the deepest available channel, which on a mature face is the exact fold it was meant to hide. Part of the problem is built into the packaging, because a doe foot applicator delivers a full swipe in one stroke, a dose designed to cover a broad area, not the small patch where darkness actually sits. Beauty editors who test concealers for a living repeat the same finding in review after review. The tubes rarely fail at the first swatch on the back of a hand. They fail at the 3rd layer applied in a hurry under bathroom lighting, so the verdict on quantity is short. Every layer past the first is future debris, and the fold is where debris collects. The second reason is the formula itself, specifically the full coverage long wear category that promises 16 hours of one swipe perfection. Those products were engineered for photography, for stage lighting, and for skin in its 20s, an even surface cushioned by its own oil. Delivering that much coverage requires a heavy load of pigment, and heavy pigment needs waxes and thickeners to hold it in suspension. So the texture feels rich and almost solid coming out of the tube. The long wear promise comes from film formers, polymers that dry into one continuous layer, built to resist transferring onto a phone screen or a collar. On a smooth young cheek, that continuous layer is the entire appeal. But a continuous layer has to break somewhere when the surface underneath it folds, and it breaks along the fold in a single concentrated seam. That is why a long wear concealer can look flawless at 9 and show one deep, sharply defined crease by midday, rather than a soft, forgiving fade. Many of these formulas also lean on dimethicone, a silicone that gives slip-on application and optically blurs the look of texture, so the mirror seems to show filled lines. A blur has no grip, though, and the silicone glides while the pigment stays behind. Some matte versions add denatured alcohol so the product sets quickly, and alcohol flashes off moisture from a surface that had little to spare. Then the day itself gets involved, because pigments and the oils around them oxidize on contact with air and skin, darkening slightly as the hours pass. The product that settles into the crease often turns a shade deeper and warmer than it went on, and the line at 3 in the afternoon can end up more pronounced than bare skin ever was. Reviewers over 40 describe the arc in nearly identical words: beautiful for an hour, then the seam. The formula is only half of the story, though, because the surface underneath it was struggling before the tube was ever opened. The third reason is the skin itself. Dermatologists describe the under eye as the thinnest skin on the face, a fraction of the thickness of a cheek, with very few sebaceous glands, the small structures that produce protective oil. With age, and especially after menopause, falling estrogen slows the production of ceramides, the fats that seal the surface, and transepidermal water loss rises. Transepidermal water loss is simply the rate at which water escapes through the skin into the air, and when it climbs, the surface dehydrates from the outside in. A dehydrated under eye develops dehydration lines, fine, shallow creases that come from thirst rather than structure, and they behave differently from true wrinkles. They deepen through the afternoon, soften after water and a night of sleep, and sit at exactly the scale of channel that pigment loves to settle into. There's a simple way to tell the two apart at the mirror. Smile once and watch. The folds that appear and deepen with the smile are structural and belong to expression. The faint cross-hatching that sits there at rest, smile or no smile, is largely thirst. Dry surface cells also lift slightly at their edges, so product grips unevenly, clinging hard in some spots and barely holding in others. And as the concealer's own water and solvents evaporate, the drying film tightens and pulls itself down into that rough texture. This is why the same tube that wore smoothly at 35 turns crepey by late afternoon at 55. The tube did not change, the canvas did, and it now needs water before it can accept pigment. That single sentence is the foundation of the entire fix, and it is where the sequence will begin. A thirsty surface is already a problem. The step the beauty counter usually recommends next takes that problem and seals it in. The fourth reason is heavy powder, and it deserves a fair hearing, because setting powder is genuinely useful elsewhere on the face. Powder exists to absorb oil. Talc, the classic base of pressed compacts, is a soft mineral that drinks up sebum and keeps foundation from sliding on a shiny forehead by 2 in the afternoon, and coarser grades of silica do the same job in many loose formulas. On the T-zone, absorbing oil is exactly what is wanted. Under the eye, there is almost no oil to absorb, so the powder takes the only moisture available, which is the water that thin skin was already losing too quickly. Pressed compacts add a second complication, because pressing powder into a pan requires binders, and those binders form their own faint film on the skin, another rigid layer where flexibility was needed. The technique called baking multiplies all of it by design. Baking, a thick layer of powder left to sit under the eyes for several minutes, came out of drag performance and studio photography, where faces are viewed from a distance, under blasting light and rarely past 30. Copied into daily life on mature skin, it builds a laminate, a stiff-dried mineral layer, bonded over a cream one, and laminates crack at the hinge. Powder also perches on top of every ridge it meets, and a heavily powdered under eye can show more texture in the 3 o'clock mirror than a bare one. With every smile or squint, the stiff layer fractures a little further. The correction for this reason is the shortest instruction in the whole sequence, and it arrives near the end. Before the sequence, one reason remains, and it is the one no product on any shelf can remove. The fifth reason is movement, and it outranks the other 4 because it is the condition they all operate inside. A ring of muscle called the orbicularis oculi wraps the eye and contracts with every blink, and common estimates put a full waking day of blinking well above 10,000 contractions. Every genuine smile pushes the cheek upward and folds the under-eye skin along the same line it folded yesterday, the way a sheet of paper creases in the identical place once the first fold exists. Squinting into sunlight through a windshield does the same. Anything resting on that surface gets folded with it, and folded material migrates to the low point, the way rainwater finds the same channel down a hillside in every storm. This is worth stating plainly, because so much makeup marketing quietly implies the opposite. A face that moves is a face that is alive, expressive, and working correctly. Movement is the operating condition, and any product or routine that only performs on a motionless face has failed the actual assignment. So the ledger now reads 5 lines: too much product, a rigid formula, a dry canvas, a drying powder, and constant motion. The first 4 can be crossed off completely with different choices, and the sequence ahead crosses them off one at a time. The 5th line stays on the ledger forever, for every face at every age, which is exactly why the sequence ends with a repair instead of a promise. If breakdowns like this one are useful, consider subscribing to Aging Queens. This channel exists to explain what specific formulas actually do on mature skin, ingredient by ingredient, so that products working against a face stop earning a place on the shelf. More brand breakdowns are coming, and subscribing is the simplest way to make sure they arrive. The sequence starts at the 3rd line on the ledger, the dry canvas, because nothing applied on top can succeed while the surface underneath is thirsty. Step 1 is the eye cream, applied first and finished before any makeup is opened. A proper eye cream carries humectants, ingredients like glycerin and hyaluronic acid, whose job is pulling water into the outer layer of skin and holding it there, alongside emollients, softer conditioning fats such as squalane, that smooth the lifted edges of dry surface cells so pigment later meets a flatter plane. On the ingredient list, glycerin sitting near the top is a good sign, and denatured alcohol sitting near the top is a warning. Within minutes of application, the water-plumped surface shallows those dehydration lines from beneath, which means there is simply less channel available for concealer to find. The amount is small, about a grain of rice split between both eyes, warmed between the ring fingers and pressed gently from the inner corner outward, never dragged. Then comes the part of the step that veteran makeup artists treat as non-negotiable and instruction leaflets rarely mention. The cream must be fully absorbed before concealer touches the skin. Fully absorbed means 3 to 5 minutes on the clock, and it means the surface no longer feels tacky or slippery under a clean fingertip. Those minutes are not wasted since brows or hair fill them easily. Skipped, they undo the step entirely, because unabsorbed cream is a slip layer, a film of still-moving emollients that concealer floats on instead of bonding to, and floating pigment slides into the fold faster than it would on bare skin. This explains a common and reasonable mistake. Plenty of women have tested eye cream under concealer, watched the creasing get worse by 10 in the morning, and concluded the cream was the villain. The step was right. The timing was wrong. Timing is also the reason this step belongs at the very start of getting ready, before the coffee and the clothes, so the absorbing happens while attention is elsewhere. The same caution applies to rich, occlusive balms and heavy petrolatum textures immediately before makeup, which seal beautifully overnight and slide badly under pigment at 7 in the morning. By midday, the difference is visible in any mirror. The under eye that started with 3 quiet minutes of absorbed hydration shows softer, shallower lines at 1 o'clock, because a portion of what read as permanent wrinkles at the bathroom sink was dehydration, and dehydration answers to water. 1 line comes off the ledger, the next 2 come off together, because they live in the same tube. Step 2 changes the concealer itself, and changes where it goes, retiring the amount problem and the formula problem at once, since the right formula is what makes the right amount possible. The category to look for is usually labeled serum concealer or skin tint concealer, and the label describes something real about the chemistry. A serum-style concealer carries a lighter load of pigment in a flexible, emollient-rich base, often with the same humectants found in the eye cream, and it dries into a film thin enough to bend when the skin bends. Sheer sounds like a downgrade to anyone raised on full coverage, so the mechanism of under-eye darkness is worth spelling out. The shadow under an aging eye comes mainly from two sources: the physical hollow of the tear trough catching overhead light and thinning skin, allowing the faint blue and violet of the vessels beneath to show through. A sheer wash of the correct tone neutralizes that color and softens that shadow, which is all the eye of a person standing at conversational distance ever registers. A heavy, opaque layer attempts to repaint the architecture of the face, and the architecture wins every afternoon. Shade matters as much as weight here, because the instinct to brighten with a much lighter concealer backfires on mature skin. Several shades too light lands as gray rather than radiant, since pale pigment sitting over a blue-toned shadow produces an ashy cast that photographs even worse than the darkness did. Makeup artists who work on women over 50 tend to reach for a shade at or barely above the skin's own, sometimes with a whisper of a peach leaning corrector beneath it to cancel blue, and nothing more. Then placement. The concealer goes only where darkness actually sits, and on many faces that means the inner corner beside the nose and the diagonal shadow of the tear trough, an area roughly the size of a fingernail. The famous triangle technique, drawing a wide wedge from the lash line down to the cheek and blending it out, was invented for stage and camera work, where distance forgives everything. On mature skin at arm's length, it deposits product across the outer half of the under eye, precisely where expression lines run deepest and where, on many faces, there was no darkness to correct in the first place. Product placed on the crease zone has one available future. The same restraint applies at the top edge, since concealer carried right up to the lower lash line rides every blink and transfers into the finest lines closest to the eye within the hour, so the color stops a few millimeters short of the lashes. The method is one thin pass, 2 or 3 small dots from the applicator or a half pump dispensed onto the back of the hand, a pause of about 30 seconds while it settles, then a second small dot only where shadow still shows through. What never lands on the moving zone can never collect in it. 2 more lines come off the ledger, and the tool in the hand becomes the next decision. Step 3 is the pressing, and it is where the wiping stops. This step governs the physics of application, and it is the beginning of an honest answer to the movement problem, because how concealer is attached decides how it behaves once the face starts working. A swipe, whether from a fingertip or a flat synthetic brush, drags pigment across the surface and lays it down in a stroke with defined edges. And an edge is a fault line, the first place a film begins to lift. Brushes earn their keep on cheeks and foreheads, broad, still planes, and streak on the hinge. Pressing works differently. The ring finger is the traditional tool for this zone for a mechanical reason. It is the weakest finger, so it naturally delivers the lightest pressure onto the thinnest skin, and it brings something no brush can: warmth. Skin temperature softens the emollients in a cream formula on contact, so a few seconds of gentle pressing lets the pigment settle down into the surface texture and fuse with it rather than bridging across the top of every ridge and pore. Makeup artists describe the goal as making the concealer become skin instead of sitting on skin. A damp makeup sponge accomplishes the same fusion with a little more control. The dampness matters twice over. First, because a dry sponge drinks a serum formula out of existence before it ever reaches the face, and second, because slight moisture helps the thin film level evenly. The motion is a press and roll along the inner corner and tear trough, never a wipe, letting the sponge's clean edge lift away any excess as it moves. One hygiene note belongs here, since this tool works millimeters from the eye. A sponge that stays damp in a makeup bag grows bacteria, so it gets rinsed and wrung out after each use and replaced on a schedule. The wear test tells the story by the afternoon. A fused film flexes with every smile and returns flat. A wiped film folds at its edges, and each fold feeds the seam. One decision remains on the vanity, and it involves the smallest container there. Step 4 demotes the powder, and on many days dismisses it entirely, which retires the fourth line on the ledger. The reasoning begins with powder's actual job, absorbing oil and preventing transfer. Under the eye, there is very little oil, and a thin fused serum layer has very little to transfer, so the honest default for this zone is restraint. For the days that call for setting, a long event, a humid climate, a photographed occasion, the specification matters more than the brand. The powder should be loose rather than pressed, translucent rather than tinted, and finely milled, which manufacturers sometimes label micronized, built on fine silica or mica rather than a heavy talc base. Finely milled particles are small enough to scatter light softly and settle into the texture, instead of perching on top of it like grit. The tool is a small precision brush or the folded corner of a velour puff, never the fluffy dome made for a forehead, and the motion is a press, never a sweep. Location is the discipline that separates this step from the baking habit, and there is a reliable way to find it. After the concealer is pressed in, smile once at the mirror, deliberately, and watch where the first faint line tries to form. That spot, commonly the inner smile line or the small area just beneath the outer corner, is the only place powder goes. Press the crease flat with the ring finger, set that one spot, and leave everything else bare. For dry skin wearing a thin, flexible concealer, skipping powder altogether is a legitimate finish because modern serum formulas are built to wear without it, and the faint, natural sheen of slightly dewy under-eye skin reads as rest at conversational distance, while a flat matte patch under each eye reads, from the same distance, as powder. By evening, the comparison settles the argument. The lightly set or unset eye looks soft and intact at 6. The baked one looks dry, gray, and cracked along the hinge. 4 lines are now crossed off. The 5th cannot be, and the day itself makes that clear by lunchtime. Step 5 is the midday repair, built for the reason that never goes away. Picture 1 o'clock at an office restroom sink or the visor mirror of a parked car. The morning sequence was followed correctly, and even so, a faint line of gathered product is visible under one eye, because since breakfast, that eye has blinked several thousand times, smiled through 2 conversations, and squinted through 1 sunny crosswalk. This is the 5th reason doing what it does, and the response in this exact moment decides how the under eye looks at dinner. The near universal instinct is to reach for the tube in the handbag and add a fresh layer over the crease. Adding fails for a reason this video has already covered. The new pigment lands on top of the moved pigment, thickens the film, and restarts the whole failure cycle with fewer hours left in it. So the line that was faint at 1 becomes a heavy, edged buildup by 5, impossible to miss under restaurant lighting. The repair goes the other direction, and it takes about 30 seconds. With a clean ring finger, press gently along the crease line and hold for a few seconds, letting warmth soften the emollients again, then smooth the gathered pigment back out of the fold with 2 or 3 light presses, redistributing what is already there. If a clear excess remains, fold a tissue, press it once against the line without wiping, let it lift the surplus away, and finish with 1 more press of the finger to fuse what stays. Nothing is purchased and nothing is added. And the under eye at 5 o'clock looks close to the way it looked at 9, carrying slightly less coverage that nobody across a table will register. For long days with no natural pause, the same move works preventively. 1 gentle blot and press at the 2-hour mark before any line has become visible. On a moving surface, repair beats reapplication, and the women who look polished at the end of long days are usually the ones pressing, not layering. Taken together, the sequence reads simply, water first with time to absorb, A thin, flexible formula placed only where darkness lives, warmth and pressure, instead of wiping. Powder demoted to one precise spot or retired, and a 30-second press at midday instead of a second layer. Underneath those 5 instructions sits one pattern, and naming it is the real point of this video because the pattern travels to every product decision that follows it. Everything that worked added hydration, flexibility, or sheerness. Everything that failed relied on heavy pigment, rigid films, or aggressive mattifiers. The under-eye past 45 is a thirsty surface that never stops moving, and the products that flatter it are the ones engineered in agreement with both of those facts, while the products that fight it, however premium the packaging, lose to a hinge and a water gradient every single afternoon. The pattern even works standing in a store aisle, reading the first 5 ingredients on a box. Water, glycerin, and light silicones near the top describe a formula built to move. Talc, heavy waxes, or denatured alcohol near the top describe a formula built for a different face, at a different age, under different light. None of that failure ever belonged to the face. The face was doing what living faces do. The formulas were doing exactly what their ingredient list said they would, to anyone ever shown how to read them. Aging queens will keep taking formulas apart this way, naming what is inside them and what those ingredients do to skin past 45, so that buying decisions can rest on mechanism instead of marketing. Anyone who wants those breakdowns arriving regularly can subscribe below and leave a comment naming the concealer that creases worst by midday, because those comments decide which formulas get examined next.